David Sarnoff, a man who evidently showed America what it really meant to go from rags to riches. He was born in Russia and lived a very mediocre life. When he and his family moved to New York, he began to sell penny newspapers to help support them. In a way, this was a small glimpse into a career that would eventually skyrocket into becoming something so successful way out of his reach. Eventually, he found himself working for the Marconi Wireless as a messenger boy, and then later a telegraph operator. This is where he heard of the disaster of the Titanic sinking. He moved up the ranks, but Sarnoff wanted more, and he knew that he was capable of more. The whole wireless broadcasting aspect was fascinating to him, and he knew it could do well. After all, he wanted not only the power, but the money. He was a smart businessman. When the Marconi business was sold to General Electric, Sarnoff was then working with the Radio Corporation of America, commonly known as RCA. Well, we shouldn't say working. The man practically worked his whole being into the company, which paid off. He was named president and became president of that company. With Sarnoff being a businessman, there was always a need to create more, and having more meant a more need for different kinds of things. And those things eventually led him to the birth of the National Broadcasting Company, otherwise known as NBC. Professor Castro, I'm just going to open up with kind of what you had talked to me about in your email. Why did you call Sarnoff the general? Like, what makes him a general?
Well, actually, he really was a general. In World War II, he became part of President Eisenhower's staff, and he was given the promotion to brigadier general. And so when he came back to NBC after World War II and to the RCA Corporation, everybody began calling him the general. And I remember when I started was 1978, which was 8 years after he had left and retired, but you would still hear people in the hallways saying, the general used to say this or the general used to say that.
That's so funny. So it's kind of like, do you think that he brought any of his, I guess, military training to, I guess, the workplace? Or do you assume that maybe he was just a very powerful person?
Well, he clearly was a very powerful person, and he was a very ambitious person. But I think it was kind of just the opposite. Actually, he brought all of his communication skills to the military. That was his job. His job was communications in the military.
Excellent. So he's also called the father of American television. Why do you think that somebody like him, who, I mean, founded NBC, why do you think he also retained that name?
Well, there's some controversy about that because there were actually three men, and Ken
Mm-hmm.
Burns did a documentary called Empire of the
Yes.
Airwaves, which
Yes, he
was
did.
about that. And he had his competitors, namely Philo T. Farnsworth, who is really credited with having invented television.
Mm-hmm.
Television goes back a long way, and most people don't realize that television, they began working on television in the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And television was ready to go in the 30s, but it was interrupted by two things. One was the Depression,
Mm-hmm.
and the other was World War II.
Mm-hmm.
But during the Depression, when television was actually ready to be launched, one of the things that the companies found out was that the last thing that people would part with was their radios.
Mm-hmm.
They would go without a meal before they would part with their
Mm-hmm.
radios. Nobody could afford during the Depression to go out for entertainment any longer. So the radio became the center of entertainment in the United States. And as a result, all of the big companies, Philco, Westinghouse, RCA, were selling radios like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And so they didn't want to compete with themselves by launching television.
Right. Oh, that makes sense. We had talked about that in class, how people would literally just like, they'd rather sell their cars and all their other possessions rather than give up their radio. It's pretty insane. So in our history of broadcasting class, we Sarnoff is described as a guy who goes from rags to riches. So would you consider him a rags to riches guy from what you've known about him?
Oh, sure. On the surface of it, you would have to say that he's, absolutely the American dream story because he grows up on the Lower East Side of New York. He's the child of immigrants from Minsk, which today is in Belarus, but in those days was part of Russia. And he is working from a very young age, and he wants to become a newspaper man, actually. But he gets a job, again, at a very young age to help support the family. He
Mhm.
gets a job at a radio station that was on the
Mhm.
top of a department store, if I recall.
Mhm.
And from that point on, his career in broadcasting begins to rise. He becomes the manager of that radio station, and
Mhm.
one step leads to the next. And before you know it, he's part of the newly formed Radio Corporation of America, RCA,
Mhm.
which would then beget the very first broadcasting company, NBC.
um, so you had mentioned before that. Have you ever Empire of the Air, that documentary? Have you ever seen that documentary
Yes, I
before?
have. In fact, I used to use it in class myself when I taught history of the broadcasting.
Okay, so I guess my next question is, how is he or David Sarnoff in comparison to Armstrong and DeForest?
Well, it's been a while since I've seen the documentary, but I think
Mm-hmm.
that the one thing that was different about Sarnoff, Sarnoff was not an inventor. Sarnoff was a
Mm-hmm.
businessman.
Right.
Sarnoff recognized the power of the medium.
Mm-hmm.
He understood right from the beginning. If we go all the way back to the very beginning of radio, radio was considered to be a point to point system,
Mm-hmm.
meaning somebody would transmit a message, it would be received by somebody else, and then passed on.
Mm-hmm.
Sarnoff was the one who realized that radio was point to mass audience.
Mm-hmm.
He understood that, and that
Mm-hmm.
was very important. He worked for, very early on, he actually worked for the Marconi Company.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very, very interested in that when I first read that part of it because my grandfather worked for the Marconi Company.
Oh my gosh.
My grandfather worked for Marconi in England,
Mm-hmm.
and then he was assigned as a ship to shore operator,
Mm-hmm.
like in the movie Titanic when they're sending the
Mm-hmm.
SOS. He was assigned to United Fruit. United Fruit being the biggest company in the world for transshipping fruit from South America and Central America
Mm-hmm.
to other parts of the world. And so my grandfather that is, traveled all around the world,
Mm-hmm.
and you know what his hobbies were? Photography and filmmaking.
Oh
So
wow.
he shot double perf 8 millimeter film
Mm-hmm.
and 35 millimeter photography everywhere that he went in the world, and he used to show me all of that. And that really
Mm-hmm.
kind of, I think, instilled in me a bit of a wanderlust
Mm-hmm.
and a desire to go into this business. So when I read about Sarnoff having worked for Marconi, I became very fascinated with that part of his life.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. So obviously you know about RCA and I guess the kind of finagling that happened there. So, Sarnoff had this giant lawsuit with Armstrong over when Armstrong left and decided to create and kind of go over to FM. Like, I guess, that whole thing was a giant legal battle for so long. Like, who do you think, I don't want to say who do you think was right, but what do you think really should have came out of that entire situation? Because it ended horribly. I mean, Armstrong killed himself. Sarnoff continued to rise as a businessman. Like it was a whole mess of things.
Yeah, it seemed like they were really spiking his invention, and
Mm-hmm.
Armstrong clearly was a great inventor as well, just
Mm-hmm.
like Farnsworth was. And it's just a shame the way it worked out. And I think it also showed that Sarnoff could be a pretty ruthless businessman
Mm-hmm.
when he had to be. And it's just, again, it's really a shame that Armstrong, such an inventive guy, would wind up taking his own life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, FM radio, interestingly, again, is another invention that comes around very early but isn't
Mm-hmm.
used until much later.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm old enough that I remember growing up and cars didn't even have FM radios. They only had
Mm-hmm.
AM radios. All of the, first generation, my music that I grew up with, the Beatles and the Rolling
Mm-hmm.
Stones and all of that, we heard that on AM radio. There was no FM radio that we listened to in those days. There was FM radio,
Mm-hmm.
but I think classical music was played on FM
Mm-hmm.
radio. And then it was probably around 1966 or 67, WNEW-FM in New York, 102.7, became the first underground rock station. And
Mm-hmm.
they would play like whole sides of Jimi Hendrix and
Mm-hmm.
Led Zeppelin. So Armstrong's invention really took off at that time and
Right.
became the most popular form of radio. And of course, today, AM radio is mainly talk radio, and
Mm-hmm.
FM radio is where you go for music.
Mm-hmm. So looking back, I guess, on Sarnoff's life, like, and doing some research, he was inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame, and, he's remembered, obviously, at NBC, and you even said that he has left his legacy there at 30 Rock. What kind of a legacy is that? Because you even said when you started working there, people were even talking about him as, like, this general, but you were there when his son was there, so.
Well, he was there at every step of the way of the Radio Corporation of America, the NBC Red and Blue networks, then the growth of NBC television, everything that became mass communications. And I think the United States was in the forefront of all of that. He's directly involved with and running. So it can't be underestimated as to how powerful a man he was and how integral he was to all of that development. And the other thing I would want to say is just, again, firsthand observation from having worked at NBC for 30 years. The first few years that I was there, from actually 1978 to 1986, the company was run by RCA. It was still RCA.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't until 1986 that General Electric took over. And in 1978, one of the things that I was very, very much aware of was that the company, the parent company, RCA, gave a tremendous amount of support to the news division. In fact, at one point they were underwriting us at $50 million a year loss.
Oh, wow.
And that's because they felt that the news division was a tremendous public service to the public itself. And also, it created a lot of goodwill for the RCA Corporation that they were providing this service. So I thought that was somewhat enlightening for a company that really the bottom line is always the bottom line, that they would underwrite the news division. That kind of went away over the years after General Electric took over, and it became much more of a business.
So I guess my last question for you, or I guess two of them, what was it like being at NBC? Since you were there for over 30 years, you really saw it grow as a company. How was that? Like, how was the change as far as, you were there when Sarnoff's son was there to when you, I guess, left, a couple of years ago or so?
2008.
2000,
and
okay.
Then I went back for 2 years as
okay.
well. Well, certainly there are things that happen in this world of communications that one can just not envision. When I started there, the evening news audience was probably somewhere around 12 or 13 million viewers for for our network alone, let alone adding up the other two networks. It was a time where America got home in time to watch the evening news and to digest it. It was a time when Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. So things change a lot over the years. I can't remember the exact year, but CNN became the first cable news 24-hour station. That was a huge change. That was a huge change. We opened MSNBC in 1996, and now we had our own 24-hour network, but we also had MSNBC.com. So we had an internet site. So communications business is changing very, very rapidly at that point. The growth of the internet, of cable television, it changed everything in the business.
That's excellent. I know just from having you as a professor and then I guess just knowing you from the past couple of years, it really seemed, especially from what you've told us, is that, NBC really has grown, especially from, just being a one, like, I guess having the one show to now,
Well, yeah, not the one. I know you didn't mean the one show.
Yeah, not the one show, but
the one network. It was just
the one network.
A broadcast network.
Yep.
And it grew from being a broadcast network into cable television, into internet, and then it grew even further with the purchase of Universal Studios. So it became NBC Universal, and it just became this gigantic corporation. And of course, today, it's not even owned any longer by General Electric. It's owned by Comcast. So the business changes. And those that don't change with it probably risk that at their own peril. Sarnoff said a couple of things that I think are kind of interesting and still apply today. He said, what the human mind can conceive and believe, it can accomplish. And he said, man is still the greatest miracle and the greatest problem on the earth.
I like that. It kind of like contradicts itself, but it's also
It's also very true.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me. That was an excellent interview, and I think that it was extremely insightful, not only from your knowledge of Sarnoff, but from your knowledge at NBC.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Appreciate you having me on.